The lights died as my heart stopped, but the secrets in room 412 had just begun to surface. Now my grieving daughter, a scorned lover, and a lawyer are locked in the dark with the man who claims to be my secret twin brother. The fluorescent lights of room 412 hummed with a sterile, mocking cheerfulness, a stark contrast to the leaden weight settling in my chest. I adjusted the thin, scratchy blanket, the polyester doing nothing to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the chill of realization, the creeping certainty that the final act of my life was being staged in this beige box, surrounded by beeping machines that were counting down my time in agonizing increments. They told me it was a complicated vascular issue, something that sounded grand and terrifying when the young, overly eager doctor used the words. To me, it just felt like my body was finally staging a coup, shutting down the machinery one by one. The prognosis wasn't good. Everyone knew it, even if they delivered the news with carefully manicured platitudes about fighting and staying positive. But the hardest part, the part that scraped against my soul like broken glass, wasn't the pain or the fear of the inevitable. It was the silence on the other end of the line. It was my daughter, Clara. 28 years old, a sharp mind wasted on a mediocre corporate job, and a heart I'd poured everything into, only to find it inexplicably closed off to me now. I tried calling every day. Sometimes she wouldn't pick up. Sometimes her voicemail would kick in, her professional, cool voice stating simply, "I'm busy. Leave a message." Once I managed to get through. "Dad," she'd said, and the flatness in her tone was a physical blow. "Clara, honey, I'm in the hospital. It's serious." There was a pause. So long I thought the connection had dropped. "I know, Dad. I saw the email from the social worker." "I need to see you," I whispered, the oxygen mask feeling suddenly suffocating. "Just for a little while. It would mean the world." "I can't," she replied, the word clipped, final. "I have a massive project deadline. I can't take the emotional drain right now, Dad. You understand." I didn't understand. I understood nothing. I had sacrificed my 20s, my entire career trajectory, to give her the best of everything. I built her a foundation, brick by painful brick, so she wouldn't have to scrape by like I did. And now, when the structure was shaking, she couldn't spare an hour? "Clara, please," I begged, the tears stinging my eyes. "I don't know how much time I have left." "I'm sorry, Dad. Call me when you're out." And then the sharp click of her hanging up. The silence she left behind was louder than any alarm in this ward. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped the cheap plastic device. I looked around the room again, the cold tiles, the peeling paint on the windowsill, the IV bag dripping clear liquid into my vein, a slow, measured release of my remaining life. I reached under my pillow, my fingers closing around the crisp, official-looking document I'd had my lawyer deliver yesterday, just in case. It was the final revision of my will, the one I'd spent weeks agonizing over, the one that shredded the carefully constructed expectations Clara had been living under for the last decade. I knew she'd be furious when she found out. I also knew she wouldn't even bother to visit me now to learn it from me face to face. Let her find out the hard way. I squeezed the paper until the edges crinkled. I had given her everything growing up, but in the end, when I needed her presence more than her gratitude, she chose her deadlines. I decided then and there that my final act of fatherhood would be one of brutal, necessary honesty, even if it meant ensuring the last thing she felt toward me was pure, unadulterated rage. A gentle knock sounded on the door. It was the nurse, bringing in my evening pain medication. As she busied herself with the dosage, my eyes drifted to the polished oak dresser across the room, where I kept my few precious mementos: a faded photo of my late wife, a hideous ceramic mug Clara made in kindergarten, and the manila envelope containing the true disposition of my estate. Just as the nurse straightened up to leave, there was another, firmer knock. A man stood in the doorway dressed in a surprisingly sharp suit, holding a briefcase and wearing an expression I didn't recognize, a mixture of professional duty and genuine, though somewhat nervous, concern. "Mr. Henderson," the man asked, his voice low. "I apologize for interrupting. I'm Mr. Davies from Sterling and Finch Attorneys. I was told you requested an emergency meeting regarding your final testamentary instructions?" My breath hitched. I hadn't told anyone here about the sudden meeting with Mr. Davies, certainly not the hospital staff. I looked back towards the door, realizing the nurse must have let him in based on the sealed envelope I'd handed her earlier. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of finality. This was it. The moment the ledger would be balanced. I managed a raspy nod. "Yes, Mr. Davies. Come in, close the door." As the heavy wooden door swung shut, muffling the sounds of the hallway, Mr. Davies stepped forward, setting his briefcase down. He looked directly at me, his eyes serious. "Mr. Henderson, I understand this is a sensitive time, but I must confirm one thing before we proceed. You are absolutely certain you wish to finalize the codicil that revokes all previous arrangements pertaining to the primary assets, specifically the real estate and controlling shares of Henderson Manufacturing, and designates the sole beneficiary as, well, as the person listed here?" He tapped the top of a thick stack of papers. I swallowed hard, tasting bile. "Yes, absolutely certain. I need you to witness this signature immediately. Clara won't be coming. I need this finalized before—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mr. Davies nodded grimly and pulled out a slim sheaf of documents. He slid them across the bedside table, positioning them perfectly under the harsh lamplight. "Very well, sir. Just sign on the designated lines where the sticky notes are placed. I have already confirmed the 2 required independent witnesses in the hallway. Once these are notarized and fully executed, the transfer is legally binding." My fingers fumbled for the pen he offered, the weight of the cheap plastic feeling enormous. I pressed the nib to the first line, prepared to etch my final spiteful message into the stone of my legacy. But just as my hand hovered over the signature box, a chilling realization hit me, cold as the hospital sheets. The codicil hadn't just named a new beneficiary, it had named someone unexpected, someone I had always kept entirely separate from my financial life, someone Clara knew absolutely nothing about. As I finally brought the pen down, ready to commit the name to paper, the door swung violently open again, unannounced and without a knock. Standing there, bathed in the hallway's sickly light, was Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and blazing with an emotion I couldn't quite place, and she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a woman I hadn't seen in 20 years, a woman I thought I had buried deep in the past, and who, shockingly, was clutching a small handwritten note addressed to me. The air in the small hospital room solidified instantly, turning thick and unbreathable. The sudden intrusion, the sheer chaotic disruption of the quiet, solemn transaction I was in the middle of, stole the breath from my lungs. My hand, still clutching the pen, froze inches above the dotted line of the final agreement. Clara stood framed in the doorway, not alone. but flanked by the spectral echo of a life I desperately tried to bury. It was Evelyn, my first love, the woman I had walked away from decades ago, believing I was doing the honorable thing for my then-fiancée, Clara's mother. But Evelyn wasn't just standing there. She looked hardened, aged by time and perhaps resentment, but undeniably here, and in her hand she held a folded piece of aged, yellowed paper, a letter I remembered writing, foolishly, passionately on the eve of my wedding to Clara's mother. "Dad, what is going on?" Clara's voice was a high-pitched tremor, her gaze darting between me, the nervous attorney clutching the will, and the unexpected woman beside her. Her professional facade had completely shattered. This was pure, raw panic, laced with accusation. Who is this? And why did Mr. Davies, my attorney, Dad, not yours, tell me you were trying to sign over everything right now? Mr. Davies, the lawyer I'd hired through my trusted firm, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He instinctively moved to shield the documents on the table, but it was too late. Clara had seen the structure of the signing, the solemn atmosphere, the notary seals, the very legal boilerplate that screamed, "Last wishes." "Clara, this is private," I managed, my voice a dry croak. I felt a sudden, profound weakness, not just from the illness, but from the sheer confrontation. I desperately needed to sign that document before she could derail it, before she could try to negotiate or threaten. "Private?" she spat, taking a decisive step into the room, forcing Mr. Davies to sidestep awkwardly. Her eyes locked onto the manila envelope under the pillow, the one I'd forgotten to hide in the rush of the surprise visit. "You haven't returned my calls for a week. You're hooked up to machines, and now you're conducting clandestine meetings with lawyers. Private. Dad, this is all I have left of you. What are you doing?" Evelyn, however, ignored Clara entirely. Her focus was solely on me. Her eyes, the same startling hazel I remembered, were hard and unforgiving. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence. "I got your call, Robert," Evelyn said, her voice low, carrying a melody of old pain that cut right through the sterile air. "Your social worker called everyone when you stopped responding to calls for 3 days. They were worried. But this," she held up the yellowed letter, shaking it slightly, "this suggests you weren't planning on letting me know you were dying until the dust settled." The note. The note I wrote to Evelyn confessing my true love, swearing I'd leave my fiancé before chickening out the next morning and burning the original draft, thinking I'd destroyed all copies. But Evelyn had kept this one, a fragment of my true, messy history, now weaponized at the most critical moment. Clara finally registered Evelyn's presence fully, a flicker of recognition, or maybe just confusion crossing her face. "Wait, who is this woman? Why do you have a letter from Dad?" Evelyn smiled, a cold, brittle expression that didn't reach her eyes. "This, Clara, is the woman your father was planning on leaving your mother for, 28 years ago, until he decided you were the more convenient choice." She turned back to me, her voice gaining strength. "I came because I wanted to know if you ever regretted destroying me. And now, Robert, I see you're trying to replace the daughter who won't visit you with whatever this document dictates." My mind raced, trying to calculate the fallout. If Clara saw the document naming Evelyn as the beneficiary, the legal battle would be catastrophic. But the emotional explosion would destroy both of them, and likely me, before the day was out. I had to stop the signing. "Stop! Nobody signs anything," I barked, startling Mr. Davies, who nearly dropped his pen. but Clara was already in motion. Driven by instinct and suspicion, she snatched the document pile off the table, her eyes scanning the headings. Her breath hitched as she saw the bold, underlined phrase, "Revocation of legacy to heir apparent, Clara Henderson." "You're cutting me out?" she whispered, the betrayal of physical force. She looked up at me, her face a mask of disbelief rapidly hardening into absolute hatred. "After everything? You're cutting me out because I couldn't drop everything for your pity party?" At that exact moment, the door handle to room 412 began to turn again from the outside. This time, it wasn't a nurse or a lawyer. A tall, imposing figure, a man I recognized instantly from old corporate files, a man who should have been retired, pushed his way into the room, his face grim. He wasn't looking at me or Clara or Evelyn. He was looking at the attorney, Mr. Davies. "Mr. Davies, I apologize for the intrusion," the man said, his voice authoritative and laced with an undeniable threat. "But my client has filed an immediate restraining order concerning the assets of Mr. Robert Henderson. Any document signed here today regarding the estate is null and void under penalty of immediate litigation. Where is the new codicil?" Clara, still clutching the paper, stared in shock. "Restraining order? Who the hell are you?" The imposing man ignored her, his eyes fixed on the paperwork. "I represent the interests of the intended recipient of Mr. Henderson's primary assets. You will hand over those papers, Mr. Davies, or I will ensure you are disbarred by morning." Mr. Davies paled, stammering, "But I haven't witnessed the signature yet. It's not final." Evelyn, however, suddenly looked triumphant, seizing the moment of legal chaos. She stepped toward me, pushing Clara aside with surprising strength, and grabbed the pen out of my limp fingers. "Robert, sign my version, the one you wrote to me 10 years ago, promising me a share if things ever went south. I have a copy, too, and it's notarized from our lunch meeting last month." Before I could process the dizzying new layer of intrigue, a second recent notarized promise to Evelyn, Clara let out a strangled cry of disbelief and fury, her eyes darting to the man who claimed to represent the intended recipient. She looked at the man, then back at Evelyn, then down at the document she still held, the one that disinherited her. "Intended recipient," Clara shrieked, shaking the document wildly. "Who is the intended recipient, Dad? Is it her, or is it the person who actually was your secret family all along?" She ripped the document in half, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and pointed a trembling finger at the imposing man in the doorway. "Tell me who you work for. Tell me who you think you're stealing everything from." The imposing man didn't hesitate. He looked directly at Clara, a cold, chilling victory in his eyes, and stated his client's name with quiet finality. "I represent Mr. Thomas Henderson, your illegitimate half-brother." The name hung in the sterile air of room 412, a grenade detonating in slow motion. Thomas Henderson. Clara froze, her hand still mid-rip on the torn will, her face instantly draining of all color. It was the kind of shock that transcended anger. It was the sudden, violent destabilization of her entire reality. I saw the exact moment the foundation of her life, the carefully curated narrative of her singular importance, crumbled into dust. "What?" Clara's voice was barely a breath, her eyes wide, fixed on the imposing stranger. "Who? I don't have a brother. There's no Thomas." The man, clearly accustomed to controlling the narrative, stepped fully into the room, radiating an aggressive calm that dwarfed the distress of the rest of us. He was tall, built like a linebacker, and his expensive suit seemed to strain over coiled muscle. He held up a smartphone, displaying a glossy, professionally taken photograph of a man in his mid-30s, a man who, with an undeniable, cruel clarity, shared my eyes, my jawline, the deep-set stubbornness around the mouth. "Thomas Henderson is very real, Miss Henderson," the imposing man stated, his tone laced with patronizing pity for Clara's ignorance. "He is the result of a brief, intense affair your father had while attending university, an affair that predates his marriage to your mother by nearly a decade. He has lived quietly, professionally, and successfully until now, and he is the rightful recipient of your father's primary estate, following the execution of the transfer documents that were prepared last Tuesday." The legal chaos had reached a fever pitch. Mr. Davies, my lawyer, was attempting to retreat into the corner, muttering about jurisdiction and emergency injunctions, completely overwhelmed by the sudden, violent introduction of a secret, legally acknowledged sibling. Evelyn, clutching her own ambiguous, notarized copy from last month, suddenly realized the game had escalated beyond her reach. Her supposed victory in confusing Clara was meaningless if the primary assets were already legally earmarked for a different claimant. Her eyes flashed with resentment, not just towards me, but now towards the very existence of Thomas. "Robert, what is this nonsense?" Evelyn hissed at me, waving the old letter accusingly. "You told me you were finally going to make things right. You promised me security. It wasn't meant to happen like this," I gasped, trying to raise my voice over the cacophony. The pain in my chest was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp electric jolt with every strained word. I tried to give Clara a chance. I wanted her to see reason. Clara, however, wasn't listening to either of the other women. She was fixated on the photograph of Thomas. The image of this unknown, successful man who seemingly held the key to everything I owned was a profound insult. Her betrayal was now layered upon betrayal. "A half-brother?" she repeated, her voice dangerously low. She looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time in this room, a dying man surrounded by the wreckage of his secrets. "All these years, you let me believe I was the only one. You let me build my entire life around the expectation that I was your sole heir, your legacy, and you kept this secret, thriving somewhere, while I struggled to meet your expectations." The imposing man stepped closer to Clara, his gaze assessing her like a piece of flawed inventory. "Miss Henderson, if you continue to interfere with a legally recognized transfer of assets, my client will seek punitive damages against you personally. I strongly advise you to step away from the premises." "Punitive damages?" Clara laughed, a harsh, broken sound devoid of humor. She spun around, her eyes blazing with a furious, desperate clarity. She grabbed the two halves of the torn will from the floor, holding them up like evidence in a trial she was about to conduct. "Right here, right now. You want to talk about punitive damages? I'm the daughter you raised. I'm the one who gave up everything for you. You think you can just erase me for some long-lost mistake?" She suddenly looked down at the papers she was holding, not the torn ones, but the final, still unsigned document Mr. Davies had slid across the table before the intrusion, the document I had paused just moments before signing. In her frenzy, Clara snatched up the document again, ignoring the signatures and the notarial blanks, and scanned the very top line, the introductory clause that established the context of the entire transfer. Her eyes snagged on a name written in my shaky, final script, the name of the other beneficiary, the one I'd named after cutting Clara out, the one I'd decided on when I truly believed she wouldn't visit. It wasn't Evelyn. It wasn't Thomas. It was a name Clara had never heard, attached to an institution I'd quietly endowed years ago. She looked up, her face a portrait of pure, horrified comprehension, realizing that her father, in his final desperate attempts to punish her neglect, had found a solution even more devastating than a secret sibling or a scorned lover. "The Peterson Home for the Chronically Ill?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief as she read the beneficiary designation aloud. "The nursing home. You left everything to the place where you plan to die?" Before anyone could react to this final agonizing revelation, that I had essentially willed my entire fortune to the facility that housed me, ensuring my comfort in my final days while cutting out all 3 contenders. The heart monitor attached to my chest began to scream. It wasn't the steady, predictable beep of standard monitoring. It was a relentless, piercing electronic shriek that drowned out the shouting, the legal threats, and Evelyn's sudden gasp of outrage. The flat line on the screen was now a jagged, terrifying wave of digital panic, and the lights in the room flickered once, violently, before plunging everything into sudden, suffocating darkness. The darkness was absolute, thick, and immediate, swallowing the harsh glare of the fluorescent tubes that had just illuminated my final moments of lucidity. The electronic shriek of the heart monitor, which moments before had been a frantic alarm, was instantly replaced by a heavy, dead silence, punctuated only by the sound of chaos. A chair scraping violently across the linoleum floor, a muffled cry of alarm from Mr. Davies, and Clara's sharp intake of breath right beside the bed. In that crushing blackness, my body seized. It wasn't a subtle fading. It was a violent, systemic shutdown, triggered by the overload of shock, betrayal, and the sudden, desperate rush of adrenaline I no longer had the system to handle. The pain, which had been a distant companion, became a white-hot explosion originating in my chest, radiating outward until my entire perception narrowed to that singular, catastrophic event. "Dad! Dad!" Clara's voice was frantic, inches from my ear, stripped bare of all its former coldness, reduced to the sound of a terrified child. Her hand, the same hand that had just torn my will in 2, fumbled blindly, searching for mine in the void. Then a different sound cut through the rising panic, the heavy, measured footsteps of the imposing man who represented Thomas. He wasn't shouting for a doctor. He was moving with purpose. "Mr. Davies, secure the documents. Now!" His voice boomed through the darkness, sharp and professional, utterly unconcerned with the medical emergency. The restraining order is irrelevant if the transfer is incomplete before cessation of vital signs. Find the papers. The air, thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear, was suddenly pierced by a sharp, metallic clink. It was the sound of Evelyn dropping something heavy, followed by a low, guttural curse. She had clearly been trying to find her own contested document in the sudden blackout. "Robert, I need that signature." Evelyn's voice, desperate and stripped of its earlier venom, was now laced with raw survival instinct. She wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. She was fighting for a promised future. I tried to speak, to signal, to assure Clara, or perhaps to tell Evelyn the truth about Thomas, but my throat was closing. A sound escaped me. Not a word, but a wet, rattling gasp that seemed to shake the very bed frame. Clara found my hand. Her grip was steel, instantly recognizing the clammy, lifeless quality of my skin. "No, Dad, hold on. They're getting help. Just hold on." But I knew it was over. The finality was total. The darkness was winning. As my vision swam, dissolving into colored static behind my eyelids, I felt a strange presence loom over the bed. It wasn't Clara, whose face I couldn't see. It was the imposing man, Thomas's representative, who was apparently leaning over me, perhaps checking my pulse, perhaps ensuring the inevitable. Just as the last flicker of my consciousness dimmed, I felt a strange pressure, not on my hand, but near my mouth. A sudden, unwelcome sensation, like something being pressed against my lips. It was accompanied by the brief, sharp scent of cheap, stale tobacco, a smell I hadn't encountered in this clean, modern hospital wing. Then, through the fading echoes of the chaos, I heard a voice, low and strangely familiar, whispering directly into my ear. A voice I hadn't associated with this room, or perhaps with any room for decades. It was the voice of the imposing man, but stripped of its legal aggression, retaining only a chilling intimacy. "It was never about the money, Father," the whisper hissed, right as the world went silent and black for me. "It was about who you chose to leave behind, and you chose wrong." The last thing my failing senses registered wasn't the sound of the medical team finally bursting in, or Clara's heartbroken scream. It was the distinct, cool pressure of that unknown object being removed from my mouth, followed immediately by the sound of a single, small, heavy item being dropped onto the crisp white sheet beside my motionless hand, an item that, even in the pitch black, felt undeniably like an old, ornate silver lighter. Then nothing. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence, broken only by the panicked murmurs of the living in the sudden dark void of room 412. The silence that followed the cessation of the heart monitor was not peace. It was the deafening vacuum left by a life abruptly extinguished. The darkness persisted for what felt like an eternity, broken only when a nurse, guided by the frantic cries, managed to fumble for and activate the emergency battery-powered lamp in the corner, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the scene of utter collapse. When the weak light finally flooded the room, the tableau was frozen in surreal horror. I lay still, the pen still loosely clenched in my right hand, the torn halves of the will scattered on the floor, and the imposing man, Thomas's representative, standing rigidly over me, his expression now carefully neutral, as if he had merely been checking for a pulse. Clara was kneeling by the bedside, clutching my lifeless hand, her face slick with tears, the shock having finally given way to devastating grief. Evelyn stood several feet away, staring at the spot where the silver lighter, a distinctive piece I hadn't seen since my college days, must have landed, her face a mask of confusion and sudden, terrifying recognition. Mr. Davies, my attorney, was halfway under the desk, seemingly trying to become one with the hospital furniture. The imposing man cleared his throat, the sound shattering the fragile quiet. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes conveying zero sympathy. "Miss Henderson, I have already contacted the appropriate authorities regarding the tampering with estate documents. If you would kindly step away from the body, we need to secure the premises." "Tampering?" Clara finally looked up, her grief instantly hardening into the familiar, defensive steel I had known her for, only now amplified by rage. She looked at the man, then at Evelyn, then back at my still form. "You think you can walk in here, admit my father had an illegitimate son, and then threaten me. You just confessed to obstructing justice." "I made no confession," the man countered smoothly. "I stated the established facts of Mr. Henderson's previous family structure, facts which are now legally relevant given the impending probate dispute initiated by Mr. Thomas Henderson's counsel. Furthermore," He paused, tilting his head slightly, his gaze falling to the crumpled silver lighter near my hand. I believe that object might be relevant evidence. Evelyn stepped forward tentatively, pointing a trembling finger at the lighter. That's Robert's. He used to carry it everywhere. He swore he lost it when he left me. She looked at the imposing man with dawning horror. Wait, you said Thomas was born from an affair at university. Robert went to State University in '88. When did Thomas turn 30? The man didn't miss a beat. Thomas is 35, ma'am. He was born in '87. Robert was quite committed to his story that he never saw the mother again after leaving school. He then looked pointedly at the lighter, which explains why this object, which Mr. Henderson carried exclusively during that period, was found in his possession now. It appears he kept it as a souvenir of that time. Clara's eyes narrowed, the fog of shock beginning to clear, replaced by sharp, methodical calculation, the corporate mind asserting itself over the heartbroken daughter. She looked from the lighter to the man, then back to Evelyn. If Thomas is 35 and Dad was 22 in '87, that means this affair predates his marriage to Mom by years, Clara murmured, piecing together the chronology. But why would Dad sign over the entire estate to him now, after keeping him secret? And why would you be the one trying to force the signing right before he died? The imposing man took another step toward the table, clearly annoyed by the speed of Clara's deduction. My client has been seeking recognition and fair compensation for years. Mr. Henderson finally agreed to settle privately, willingly transferring the bulk of the assets to Thomas to avoid a messy public paternity suit that would have destroyed the Henderson name and, frankly, your mother's memory. Evelyn let out a sharp, wounded cry. He was going to leave me nothing. After all these years, he was going to leave me with nothing but an old letter and a promise he broke twice. She then looked at the lighter, her eyes suddenly blazing with a terrible insight. Wait a minute. That lighter. I remember that lighter. Robert showed it to me once, saying it was a gift from his first fiancée, the one he didn't leave. The room plunged back into complete tension. Everyone looked at Evelyn, then at Clara, then back at me, the silent corpse who seemed to hold the key to the final, most damaging secret. Clara felt the weight of the implication, the interlocking pieces of her father's deceit. If Evelyn was the first fiancée, the one he didn't leave, and Thomas was the secret child from an affair after that engagement. She looked down at the silver lighter lying next to my hand, recognizing the archaic design from old family albums she'd barely looked at. She carefully reached out, her fingers brushing the cool metal, and turned it over. Engraved on the base, hidden from casual view, was a delicate looping inscription, "To R.H., forever yours, MP." Clara didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked solely at the imposing man representing Thomas. "Thomas is 35, Clara stated, her voice steady, terrifyingly calm. He was born in '87. Evelyn, you said you were his fiancée when he received that lighter, which has an inscription from someone named MP. If Dad was 35 when he died today, and Thomas is 35, then Thomas isn't the secret son from the affair you're claiming." She stood up straight, facing the imposing man down. "Thomas Henderson is not the result of a youthful dalliance. Thomas Henderson is the same age as my father was when he supposedly had that affair. Thomas Henderson is the man you are trying to install as the rightful heir, because Thomas Henderson is my father's twin brother, separated at birth and hidden by the family for decades to protect the legacy. The affair story was a convenient lie to cover up a secret sibling rivalry, wasn't it? The imposing man's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. His jaw tightened and his eyes flickered toward the door, considering a hasty retreat. He had been prepared for a grieving daughter and a desperate ex-lover. He had not been prepared for a meticulous analysis of birth dates based on a decades-old piece of engraved jewelry. "That is slanderous speculation, Miss Henderson," he managed, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara didn't flinch. She picked up the lighter, the evidence of her father's deepest, most protected secret now finally exposed in the weak, yellow light. Speculation? Or the truth you were trying to bury with a fake paternity claim? The will I tore up was leaving everything to the nursing home. The will you rushed in here to execute was leaving everything to a secret twin. Which one is the real lie, Mr.? She paused, leaning in close, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper meant only for him. "Because I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to find Thomas, and I'm going to learn every single lie my father ever told. And if he truly has a twin brother who has been kept in the dark his entire life while Dad inherited everything, well, then there are two of us who have a legitimate claim to tear down the entire Henderson legacy." She held the lighter aloft, a grim trophy of the ensuing war, the finality of my death, merely the starting gun for a battle for everything I owned.